police have told us it's so big we can't just march once, we're going to have to march across the harbour bridge twice. So this is incredible. It's a mass march for humanity to stop a genocide. Our politicians have to now listen to the will of the people and sanction Israel. Stop sending weapons.
But no, they didn't, did they, mate? They didn't sanction Israel. They didn't stop supplying parts for the F-35 fighter. Instead, as a result of one of the biggest mass protests in Australia's history, they threw a few dollars at the problem, and then they said they would recognise Palestine at the next sitting of the UN. Well, that was on the cards anyway, because already 147 of the 193 member UN states recognised Palestine. So that was going to happen. So despite such a large protest, despite such a huge turnout and expression of freedom of speech, which was great, I know, I was there, did it actually achieve its aims? And the question that comes to is a more fundamental one of our society, being democracy. Yeah, we have it, but does anyone ever really listen? I'm Bintang Bernie, and this is Friday News Review. Welcome to the program. Now, at the outset, it's important I say that this is not intended to be a slight against democracy. I think democracy is a very good thing. I think it has a lot of pitfalls, but I think it's a very important and crucial part of modern society, and it's something we should stand by. What we're going to look at today is issues of whether our democracy is really as effective as it should or could be. And do we really have as much say as we want? And the other thing I'm at pains to point out at the start of the program is this is certainly not at all intended to disparage or be a slight against the people who organised the Palestine March across the Harbour Bridge. I think what you people did was outstanding. You are the kind of people who should be getting Australian of the Year awards. I think it's amazing. I mean, could you get 300,000 people to turn up to one of your events? I'm happy if I get 3 people to watch this show. So it's not intended to disparage them, but it is intended to point out that despite such a momentous effort, a huge undertaking which was incredibly successful and brought such massive, not just public, but international awareness and spotlight on what's happening in the Middle East, the protest march wasn't just about recognising Palestine. As the protest organiser there himself said, it was to end the genocide and to stop Australia supplying parts for the F-35 fighter, which is used to bomb Palestinians. Neither of which that march achieved, and not through any lack of effort or for any failing of the march itself. But the fundamental question that Western democracies all need to start looking at, and I guess we all need to see if we can find an answer to, is despite the fact that we have democracy, does anyone actually listen to it? And by that what I mean is, how much say do we as a populace have in our government? And as you've heard me say many times on this program, one of the fundamental components of democracy is the right to vote, but it is not the essential element of democracy, as I see it. As I've always said, the key to democracy, the key to living in a truly democratic society, is being able to hold those who are in power over you to account and to force them through democratic processes to listen to the people's voice, to listen to the people's opinion, and to reflect that opinion and that mood of the populace. And I'm going to look at some examples of how that's done, both here and overseas. But first, let's go back a few years. Now, does anyone remember this little prick? Yes, our former war criminal in chief, John Howard. Now, I'm going to read to you some transcripts, because when John Howard took Australia to war in Iraq, in the Gulf War, he did so without a approval of the majority of Australian people. He did so without a democratic process. And he blatantly stated that he would ignore such process. So I want to read to you, and I'm going to read to you the transcript just so we get it exactly right. And it was from the first one's from an interview with Neil Mitchell, a radio host in Melbourne. I'm not much for shock jocks, as anyone who knows me is well aware, but it's important that this came up. Now, the question that Mitchell put to him was the fact that at the time, opinion polls were showing that the majority of Australians did not want to be involved in a war in Iraq without UN mandate. That was the issue, was that this was done without a mandate from the United Nations. Now, there in itself is another issue touching on democracy, world democracy. We have established the United Nations, yes, and I know it is corrupt and I know it is politicized, but it still is essentially designed as a democratic body. The world countries vote and pass on resolutions, and one had not been passed or made on Iraq. So the very fact that you are getting into a war without a UN mandate raises the spectre of, well, is democracy a part of this decision-making process or not? We keep getting told democracy is fundamental to our way of life, and yet we continually ignore it when it suits us. So first off, Mitchell asked John Howard, what did he think? The fact that Australians wanted a UN mandate. In other words, they wanted a world democracy, a democratic body, to have a vote and decide whether we should be involved. At that time, the opinion polls ran as high as 70% of Australians opposed to war in Iraq without UN mandate. And this is what Howard said, and I quote, "I will take what I think is the right decision in Australia's long-term interest. I will brave public opinion. I will listen to the public. In the end, however, this, as on other issues such as the introduction of a new tax system, there are a number of other things that I won't just be swayed by the latest opinion poll." Now, here again we have a supposedly democratically elected leader of a democratic nation, and one of the most democratic and stable in the world, by the way. We are very lucky. I know it all sounds like there is things to criticize, but we're doing it pretty good. But here we have our democratically elected leader blatantly stating that, well, when it comes to the really important things, we can have a plebiscite on, which ineffectual person is a head of state. We can have a plebiscite on gay marriage. That's important, okay. But once again, something that was clearly favoured by most Australians for a long time before the government was forced to act. But here we have a Prime Minister saying, yeah, I'll listen to you on all the little things, but when it comes to something like sending our servicemen and women to go off and potentially be killed, and to go to another part of the world and kill people there, well, that's much too important a debate for you people to have. Leave it up to me and the boys at the top. Once again, a fundamental failing of democracy. At the time, ABC also had a headline. Okay, these are headlines taken from the period. This is the ABC's take on it. The Prime Minister says Australia would go to war against Iraq even if military conflict did not have broad community support. I can't say it any clearer. Are we living in a democracy, or are we living in a totalitarian dictatorship? Here is our leader saying, well, it doesn't matter what the community wants. It doesn't matter if they're all against it. I'm going to do it anyway. And this is fundamental to the key we have to ask ourselves about, do we really live in a democratic world? Do we really live in a democratic society? I'm going to show you some video now from overseas. And we'll look at what's happened. You've seen what happened in Australia. Look at what's happened in the UK recently. Another democracy.
They came in their hundreds, as they said they would, despite the threat of arrest and a possible prison sentence of up to 14 years. They carried signs professing their support for Palestine Action, a group designated a terror organisation by the British government. Some emblazoned their message on T-shirts as they sat silently at the foot of the Mahatma Gandhi statue in Parliament Square, while others were angered by what they deemed as an assault to their freedom of speech.
If we can't come down with 7 words on a sign and sit quietly, then what does freedom of speech mean?
Some had already been arrested for taking part in previous protests, but returned, such as grandmother Manji Mansfield, apparently undeterred by the consequences.
This isn't the Britain that I grew up in. We're now living in an alternative universe, and I'm not going to accept it. So I'm frightened, but I'm more frightened of what will happen if I don't.
This is the largest gathering of support that there has been for Palestine Action since the group became a prescribed organisation. And judging from the numbers that have turned out this Saturday, it's also proving to be a challenge for the police themselves. The government says its ban aims to end acts such as this, the damaging of military aircraft at a British airbase, which the activist said was in protest against the UK refuelling of Israeli fighter jets. But it's done little to deter people determined to pledge their support. The number of arrests is likely to be a test for a police force and judiciary under strain from a backlog of cases and a decline in public investment. And containing the outrage against the ban is yet another hurdle facing authorities dealing with public anger that is yet to subside. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, London.
Now, isn't that an interesting reflection on democracy? People simply sitting quietly and protesting. Okay, there was no agitation there, and they're being arrested by the police. Now, the reason they're being arrested is because in the UK, the group Palestine Action has been designated a terrorist organisation. I'm laughing as I say it. A couple of important things though, a couple of points though to think about. Who determines these designations? And we'll talk about one that Australia designated a terrorist group in a moment. But who determined that Palestine Action is a terrorist group? And what evidence do we have for it? Well, yeah, they did break into a Royal Air Force base and they sprayed some paint in the engines of aircraft. Okay, and yes, that's damaging and it's caused issues. It was done in such a way that it wasn't unsafe. It's not like they sabotaged the aircraft. It was obvious that the aircraft had been attacked, so no one would have attempted to fly that aircraft. But the reason that they sprayed those aircraft was that they were being used to refuel Israeli fighter jets in the air as part of their bombing of Gaza. So it's a very valid connection that they've made there and a very valid point that they've tried to make. And I don't really see that spraying red paint on an aircraft is a terrorist act. And of course, then we come to the huge designation of, well, as we often say, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But in the terms of the UK, okay, so they've designated Palestine Action a terrorist group. Now, those people that you saw being arrested and dragged away by the police, and as you would have seen on the news if you've been watching it, in one case, a 93-year-old grandmother was arrested and taken away by the police, albeit very gently and very respectfully, but she's still having a civil rights taken away from her. She was arrested. These people are being arrested because they're holding up a sign saying they support Palestine Action. So you have to ask yourself, in a truly free and democratic society, if you hold up a sign for a group that the government designates as a terrorist or anything else that the government doesn't like, does that warrant being arrested? If I sat down in Australia, and we're going to come to the issue of Hamas, which has been designated by the Australian government as a terrorist organisation, if I sat in the middle of the city with a sign saying I support Hamas, am I really doing any great harm? Would it not be my right as a free citizen in a so-called free society to say, well, that's what I feel, if I felt that way. It's an interesting point for debate, and once again it comes back to the very question of democracy. What actually constitutes our democratic rights? Now, coming back to Hamas, as I just mentioned, out of the 195 UN member states, did you know that the number of UN states who have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization, do you know how many it is? 9. 9 out of 195 states designated Hamas as a terrorist group. And of course, Australia is one of them. I'll read them off to you just so I get it right once again. Okay, it's Australia, Canada, Paraguay, Israel, not surprisingly, Japan, New Zealand, UK, US, and the European Union as an entity, as a single block, designated it. They're the only people who have designated Hamas as a terrorist group. Do you know why? Because in 2006, Hamas won a majority of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Assembly. In other words, they were elected into power. Democracy, once again. But see what happens with democracy? When a group of people elect someone that we determine we don't like, that they want but we don't, well, of course, that's the trick. Straight away, we designated Hamas a terrorist organization as a result of that democratic election. When was Hamas founded? Hamas was founded in 1987 as a result of, or in response to the first Intifada, the uprising against Israeli occupation. So it was founded in response to Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine, and now we designate it a terrorist group, well, us and 8 other countries in the world, because it is fighting against Israel. And as I said, it was formed as a political group and it won in an election. And that's when Australia decided to designate it a terrorist group. Look at the travesties of democracy that have happened. Look what happened recently in Romania. We got a pro non-EU candidate who was against the European Union, was against NATO, who was elected in Romania and who was subsequently declared illegal. Once again, the poor, stupid Romanians elected the wrong person, didn't they? Look what's happened in Moldova recently, where a local representative who has spoken out about the European Union has now been found guilty of corruption, has been put in jail. And we can go back further still, of course, to 2014, when Viktor Yanukovych, the democratically elected president of Ukraine, was overthrown in a coup orchestrated by the Obama government, with, smiling Joe Biden and that bitch, the Cookie Monster, walking around handing out food, Victoria Nuland, who had, we now know, thanks to Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, who himself was illegally imprisoned when Australians democratically wanted him to be released. He showed, by releasing the phone call of Victoria Nuland speaking to the Ukrainian ambassador from America, discussing candidly about which person they would have to replace Viktor Yanukovych once they'd overthrown him. The man that the Ukrainians had democratically elected, which has led to an 8-year war up until 2022, when Russia had to get involved to stop a genocide of its people in the Donbass. Democracy has been corrupted, has been manipulated, and the question that we need to ask is, does it really ever actually truly exist? How much democracy is there in the world? How much say do we have in the world? Now, I'm going to go to Indonesia, because something has come out in Indonesia lately which is great. And as you know, I've been critical of Indonesia's democracy, in that Indonesia, like a lot of countries, makes it an offence to officially criticise the government. I mean, the things I say about my government here, I'd be very hesitant to say about the Indonesian government if I was an Indonesian citizen. But Indonesia is a democracy. It's a young democracy, and it's growing. And I think these problems, these restrictions on government criticism will relax over time. But lately, one thing that happened in one of the regencies in a place called Jawa Tengah in the middle of Java is the local regent, who I guess you'd call probably equivalent to a council, I guess, in some ways. Not quite a governor, but a mayor would be probably a more accurate description. He slapped a 250% increase on the land tax equivalent for people's housing. Because he turned around and he said, oh, well, I haven't had a tax increase for ages, that's what I'm going to do. People were outraged. You can imagine having your rates essentially go up by 250%. Outrageous. When people complained, he very arrogantly said, well, I don't care, you can come, you can protest, I'm not going to listen to you, that's what's happening. See, once again, an issue where a man who was supposedly democratically elected to represent those people blatantly said, no, if you protest what I've done, I don't give a shit. See, that's what the issue is with democracy, where people don't understand the very premise of the democratic system that they actually are supposed to represent and enforce. So the Indonesians were outraged. And one thing I'll say about the Indonesians, lovely people, very friendly, great, nice, warm, welcoming. But when they get angry, fuck, do they go off. And as you're about to see, I'm going to show you some video of their protest. Now, the reason I've chosen this, because what is great about this, and it's one of the fundamental issues about democracy, one of the key complaints I have is accountability. In our government and our system of democracy, no one is ever held to account. Governments can make mistakes. I mean, look at, late David Littleproud, little to be proud of by name, little to be proud of by nature, and his $80 million water scam in the Murray-Darling, Barney buy me a beer Joyce, writing a report, a text message, and, none of these people are ever held to account for the wastage, for their mistakes. But in Indonesia, it's gone slightly differently. The guy at the center of it, Sudewo, he's actually offered to change the tax. He reneged on it. When people protested, he said, okay, you've gone off about this 250% increase in your rates. I'm not going to do it. But that wasn't enough. The Indonesians demanded that he be sacked from his position. What the Indonesians actually wanted was accountability. You fucked up big time. You know what? Just saying sorry and undoing it isn't good enough. It ain't going to cut it. You need to go. Now, I should stress, I'm not advocating Trumpian-style raidings of Parliament House. I'm not saying that we should, throw rocks and stuff at the police, as you're about to see. But it is interesting to see where people of a nation turn around and they say, no, it's not good enough just saying I'm sorry. You need to go, mate. You need to be held accountable. Because when you think of it, we're all held accountable in our positions. In my previous jobs, all of them, if I made a huge mistake, okay, I was hauled in straight away. I could be sacked. I mean, I remember I used to drive buses for the government. I remember being told, you steal 10 cents out of the coins. That's back when we used to take fares and have cash. They'll sack you on the spot, okay, because you're misusing public funds. That's public money. It belongs to the state government. It's from the people, for the running of the government, of their government. You can't, embezzle any of that. And yet we see in this country blatant misuse of funds, appalling decisions made. Where is the accountability? Where is the Indonesian example where we say to somebody, when you make such bad decisions, it's not enough just to say, okay, and move on, or I'm sorry. You need to be held accountable. The same in all of our organisations. I've seen senior managers, leaders of organisations, screw up time and time again, waste vast sums of money, vast sums of public money, hundreds upon hundreds of thousands. They're never held to account. Look at the AUKUS debacle. Look at the money squandered by our defence ministry. Remember when we bought the Sea Sprite helicopters? Those helicopters have been sitting in the Mojave Desert since 1965, some of them, and we bought them and we were going to update them. We spent millions and millions before it was decided the project didn't work. Well, who got the sack over that? Who got kicked out over that? So yeah, I'm just going to show you this clip from Indonesia, and you can see how the Indonesians react. Not when someone says I'm sorry, not when someone says I'm not going to go through with it, but then when they stay in office. Now, as you see, it was a lot of plastic water bottles and quite interestingly enough, a lot of shoes being thrown. Now, I'm not advocating that we march down to Canberra and throw rocks at Parliament House or chase huge groups of police away, hitting with sticks and so forth. I do think, though, we need to take a stronger stand. I think at times for a democracy and a protest to be really effective, there are times we need to step outside of the law. And by saying that, I'm not advocating violence by any means whatsoever. I abhor it. But things like, mass sit-ins in the middle of the city, disrupting traffic and so forth. And of course, all the right-wing conservatives come out like they have done over the government's recognition of Palestine. I love one of the points they make. They keep saying, it's not going to make any difference. Well, why are you so upset about it then? If it's not going to make any difference, what's the issue? Shouldn't worry you. But I think we need to actually start looking at taking a more assertive role as a populace in our democracy. And I don't have the exact answer of how we do that without descending to violence and violent clashes. But I think the lesson that I think we should draw from the Indonesians is not about the throwing stuff and carrying on. But the lesson we should draw from the Indonesians is that we shouldn't be satisfied with just simple sorries, changes of view. Penny Wong doesn't deserve her position. She has hidden behind this Israeli defence line. She has gone against the will of the Australian people. We need to start taking more of a stand about making these politicians accountable for their actions, because only then will they start to think about their actions. And as I said in a previous program, I wrote a submission to Parliament which was read out by Marine Faruqi, the Green Senator. She butchered it, unfortunately. But it was asking Penny Wong to explain the decision that she made when she ceased funding UNRWA. Decisions that are being made without due regard, rashly. What accountability do people like her and others have when they make these ridiculous decisions, which we all know to be bullshit and to be wrong? They just move on. In Penny's case, she gives a few thoughtful frowns and hums and hms, and it's very complicated. But there is no accountability. There is no actual action taken. These people get away scot-free with mistakes, with blatant abuses of power, with blatant lack of regard for what we the people want. And it's time we need to look at how we deal with that and how we try to change that system. Because as we all know, the people running the world are not us. It's not you, it's not me. We don't have a say. And as I've mentioned before, it is a valid point to make that we effectively live in limited tenure dictatorships. We vote a government in, they do what they want, there's no accountability, and they walk away at the end of it scot-free. Look at Bridget McKenzie in the sports rorts. Should that woman be in Parliament? Bronwyn Bishop and helicopter rides. Where is the accountability for any of these people? It doesn't exist. So, in closing, I'm going to change our usual sign-off because I've thought about the type of people that run the world and how the world is structured. And I've turned to Jarvis Cocker because he's put it much more eloquently than I ever could about who really runs our world. So Bintang Bernie, wishing you all the best for the weekend, reminding you always, those two types of people, avoid them both. Over to you, Jarvis.